Welcome to the fifth Industrial Revolution. My name is Rachin Kansal. I'm a professor at Seton Hall University, Department of Management at the Stillman School of Business. Prior, I spent 20 years in healthcare. So where are we going as planet Earth and humans? One of the trend lines seems to be that there is innovation in technology, there's innovation in food, there's innovation in sustainability, but there's a climate crisis as well. And the future of planet Earth, even though there are a lot of scares about it, does look like it is going towards sustainability, right? So is that the fifth industrial revolution, sustainability of planet Earth? On the other hand, within the last 2 weeks, Richard Branson went up in space. Jeff Bezos went up in space a little bit higher. And Elon Musk doesn't need to go into space because he's already sent the Tesla into space, right? But we are seeing this race for space heat up, and Wall Street is calling it the next trillion-dollar industry. There are spaceports popping up. So is that the fifth industrial revolution, the race for space and space exploration? The barrier to both of these, if we think of a climate crisis on planet Earth and sustainable human future, and if we think of space exploration, human bodies are not built for any of those futures. But can we use genetics and modern technology to adapt human bodies to survive on planet Earth and in space? We could. So is health technology going to be the fifth industrial revolution? That is really our thesis, and that's what we're exploring. This is, like I said, a graduate level course and a narrative project exploring the intersection of human existence, health technology, and the future of space and Earth. We are inviting guests who can speak to these topics. It's certainly an emerging topic, and we are inviting guests who can speak to it from different perspectives. And today, it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Ed Cox. Ed and I are great friends and go back almost a year now. Ed is an executive vice president at Eversana, integrated services platform providing services to the biopharma industry, and also a CEO of a pharma industry in his past. And more interestingly, he's also a big fan of Japanese anime. And today we will, of course, pick his brains on healthcare, but we will pick more of his brains on this whole idea of Japanese anime and what lessons it may have for what we see today and the future. And of course, Anthony Pizzoni, who you see on the screen and Tillman picture, two of my students will be joining us in asking these questions as well. So with that, again, welcome, Ed. Thank you for making the time. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, no, Rushan, thank you so much for having me. And it's an exciting topic, and it's an exciting conversation to have. As way of background, I am EVP at Eversana. I'm also global head of digital medicine here at Eversana. Before that, for 5 years, I was the chief executive officer of a digital therapeutic that got FDA breakthrough status in Alzheimer's. Which at the time was the first digital therapeutic to get a breakthrough as a monotherapy. Really proud of that work. And I'll probably touch on that a little later as well. Was the inaugural chairman of the Digital Therapeutic Conference Series, which we now call DTX East and West. And I've had the chance to rotate from biotech to pharma to digital health to digital medicine, and now effectively an intersection of all of those things. And to your point, Ruchan, I do think that the fifth industrial revolution, or like the next step, and we are living in it over the last 18 months, we are living in it, yep, is this lightning pace that we are moving forward in life science, healthcare, and digital health. And I think that getting to the topic that we're going to use as our framing mechanism. Mm-hmm. Which is one of my interests and passions, which is in many ways a lot of escapist television and film, and as a subset of that, animation, and as a sort of a narrow focus on that, Japanese anime, which I've been a fan of since I've been in high school. And I think that there are some really interesting things about where we are right now, where we are going. A lot of this space travel that I think I could that it'll be fun to speak about. I will say I I am not going to purport to be a expert in Japanese anime. I'm a passionate fan, and using that as a frame of reference for how I've seen many of the things that have happened. I think it's an interesting observable trends. But I don't want someone watching this and say, wait, there's so many published articles published authors on this topic. I am not one of those, but I do think that it's a way to explore the possibilities of the future in ways that I think lots of times those of us in life science or those of us in tech have not yet explored. So
and that is really what's interesting here. We are not looking for real experts in Japanese anime, but we are looking for a framing. So you are going to be a perfect person to speak to. And with that, of course, when we talk of Japanese anime, and for our purposes, it is post-World War II developments that you shared with me that you think are very relevant to our conversation. So why don't you, for benefit of our audience, just provide a brief overview of Japanese anime and why you think that is relevant to our discussion. Why don't we start with that, and then I do have some questions on some of the themes we have observed there.
Sure.
We'll have a discussion on those.
Yeah. So I'll frame it even broader. So obviously, the Japanese effectively founded the genre of anime, which is a form of animation, but it is now much broader, and that anime is made all over the world now.
Yeah.
And I think that's around that. The reason that this topic, which might seem somewhat diagonal, came up is Rucha and I were having a conversation about effectively the future and how the different future possibilities. And I made the observation that many of these questions have in fact been explored for more than 40 or 50 years now in anime. And I find that to be a really interesting idea, in that anytime that humanity was on the precipice of exploring something new, sometimes there were people thinking about it. And in many ways, you're almost like beta testing concepts.
Yes.
Right. What's interesting, I've always found as a consumer of the product, is a lot of it almost felt was focused on the scientific execution first and the entertainment component of a second, versus like I love the MCU. I love Marvel Cinematic Universe. But at its core, it's meant to be entertaining first and exploratory second, third, fourth, maybe seventh or something. So and so we just had this conversation in which some of these conversations about how humans are going to exist in space, what will the likely dynamics be? I feel like, my opinion is there is a library of hundreds, not even hundreds, many thousands of these potential pathways, these potential sort of like realities, journeys, experiences that a team of writers thought through what would happen, wrote out what happened, and it's worth observing. And I think that's interesting in that is that you could say, well, pick an outcome. There's literally someone like who spent 3 or 4 or 5 years figuring out where the arc of this would go. Right. And I find that really fascinating on the topic that we're talking about, because it is a way to say, oh, that's how that future could go, or that's maybe how you would mechanistically solve that problem.
So that is absolutely a wonderful observation, right? The future that we aspire for or think of has already been created in our magazines, in our comics, in our stories, in our mythology, even in our pyramids, some would argue, and the architecture all over the world. But you talked about this library of more than thousands and thousands of these comic books and anime. What are some of the key themes that, from you as a fan perspective, have really resonated with you, where you think there is this correlation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, especially around the concept of like space travel in our solar system, right? Because if we think about like the way that we've been thinking about space travel from an entertainment standpoint as kids is it's Star Wars. It's framed by Star Wars, right? Yeah. And to some degree, secondly, framed by Star Trek. Well, that is, Star Wars is totally romantic, but it literally is in a galaxy far, far away a long time ago, right? Versus if you compare something to Gundam, right? So Gundam takes place, it has multiple timelines, but its main timeline is called the Universal Century, right? And it is a hard science anime. And so it is, okay, we have too many people on Earth. We have to create a new sustainable way for this species called humans to live long term. How would we do it, right? And because you're talking about storylines that are many hundreds of episodes explored over 30 or 40 years in the real world versus a 2-hour film where the protagonist and the antagonist have to fight, and at the very end it's all fine.
Yeah.
You explore it in different ways. And so it's not to say that we don't make great dystopian films here in the US or futurist films in the US, but resolving it in 2 hours is very different than resolving it in 2,000 episodes. So an example would be and I'll use just this, and we'll jump around to different animes.
No, absolutely.
To jump off the page, but the idea that you're going to have to build space colonies.
Yeah.
Right. The idea that when you build space colonies, you will inevitably create different class systems. Where does that go in terms of resource allocation? And I think you're just beginning to see this explored in TV shows. Like, I think Battlestar Galactica did a good job of it, about 15, 20 years ago. I think the show, I'm blanking on the name, but the show that's presently on Amazon, is, Tillman, do you remember the name? I'm
The
blanking.
Expanse, is that what you're going for?
Exactly. The Expanse explores some of this, but for instance, the first Gundam series came out in the 1970s. So that means that, many years before any of this stuff was committed to film, many hundreds of episodes explored this. And I think that that's an interesting idea of saying, okay, how are we really going to do this? So we're not talking, hyperspace and wormholes and lightsabers and knights and kings. This is like, how do we get food up there?
Yeah.
Where does water come from? Will humans live longer in space, or will they live shorter in space? And I thought that was I think it's an interesting way to explore that entirely in a hard science framework, that everything that has to be, is there. But also one of the ideas is that, are you going to have to do gene editing to make humans better sustainable for space? And an interesting idea, and I don't know that I agree with it, but it's an interesting exploratory idea, is this concept of new types, where if all of a sudden humanity went to space at scale and was in space for many thousands of years, would there be evolutionary changes that would happen, not sort of projected by man, that we do on purpose, but would it happen organically?
Yeah.
And that's an interesting idea, that going back to the 1970s, someone's like, let's explore all of these implications in a way that someone could observe and like, wow, they thought through a lot of those problems that we'd have to figure out,
You made some very, very interesting points there. So, and I'll just talk about two for a second. So one concept that you brought up was this whole idea of that space exploration is about resources, right? It is about sustaining human life, whether on planet Earth or in space, but we will go into space because of the resource need. And you moved away from the idea of space is romantic, and therefore we should go there. So that is one theme I gathered, and I'll come back to the question I have on that. And then the other theme that I gathered from what you just said is, this whole idea of organic versus inorganic transformation of human beings over time, so they can adapt to different environments. So the question I have is, and this is again something that seems to be the theme of at least the Japanese anime. One is, the relationship between technology and humans, and who we are as humans to begin with. So what are your views on that? I mean, are we going to do it because that's what we need to survive, or is it because of the romanticism that exists in human race that we will explore space?
I think so it's interesting because in many ways you have these conflicting romantic concepts going against each other.
Yep.
Right? Is the romantic concept of we must go to space, we must explore.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time is to be human is this and not that.
Right.
Right. So those, in other words, like these are two very like primal ways of thinking. Humanity has always wanted to explore. And humanity has always had a pretty clear sense of like what I am, what I'm not. Right. And so I think that you're going to see a lot of that stuff, begin to come into conflict. I will say that I think that exploration at scale is almost always resource driven. Right. I think that's part of it. But I think that's part of the interesting thing. And I almost would recommend to many of these future leaders to say, hey, if you're going through these questions, sit down with some popcorn and watch a couple 100 hours of this. And like, you'll watch a protagonist spend an entire season asking the question, what does it mean to be human?
Right.
Like they'll literally like that, like, as in that will be the exact question, is that like, okay, do I make this transition? Do I, augment myself robotically, or, do I download my consciousness to the AI? And you see this like struggle that they're having of like, what does it mean to be human? And I think that that's actually kind of a good, useful, safe sandbox to say, yeah, you're not the first person that had this question. Someone else had this question.
Yeah.
Sitting in the seat of a protagonist and said, wow, what would they think through? What would, and so I think that's, we don't need to learn every lesson first.
Right.
Some lessons have been explored. And I think that's, you can get good ideas if you look at different things from different perspectives and not imagine you're the first one to ask the question. Because in this case, as it relates to the near-term future of humanity, as in the next couple 100 years, there has been at least one art form explore it several thousand times, and that was sort of my underlying hypothesis for why it's worth leaning into.
Yeah, no, and I mean, you're right. There are a lot of scenarios that have been already thought through and portrayed in the world of animation. Now, you also talked about, the conflict and the question of who we are as humans. One other thing that is also a constant theme of some of these anime is we almost tend to live in a fantasy land, right? There is this question of who we are as humans, and there is a right and a wrong, and there seems to be a very black and white line between that. At the same time, there is a fantasy land where everything seems a little bit utopian and a little bit out there, and we create these fantasy lands to get away from what we may be suffering on planet Earth, and especially in Japanese anime, that was their way to get away from the suffering of the nuclear, the atomic bomb. So what are your views on that? Is the future going to be a little bit more of a fantasy land that we create and macrocosms that we create to enable that, or is it going to be?
Well, I think like with any of these things, that it's there's a spectrum. I mean, many of these are quite introspective, right? Many of these are. I mean, certainly you're going to have a lot of things that are of a fantasy nature and escapist nature, but many of them are, in fact, I find much more introspective and much more grounded than the majority of our entertainment, in the U.S. I mean, like, and I love it, but like, we have now gotten completely normalized that Thor, as in the god of thunder of Norse mythology, is like something completely normal in our consciousness and fights a guy called Iron Man.
Yeah.
It's just like all of those are great, but like you talk about really, really, really escapist, that's really escapist. Now I happen to love it, but like that is very different than some of these things of saying like, okay, have we yet invented the type of technology that makes deep space travel possible? Yeah. Right. And so I think there's that. I mean, humans are really good about finding ways to shape their reality to make it more palatable. That's true. That's true. We've always been good at that. But reality and our desires almost always eventually kind of come into conflict in some way. But I actually think that the majority of best solutions that humanity have ever come up with was thinking in a very asymmetrical way.
Yeah.
And frequently in a very romantic way, in a very like, I mean, we're gonna sail a boat off the end of the earth, maybe.
Yes.
Okay, so that's a very outside, like that's not just a different way of thinking. That is a aspirational and romantic way of thinking. You have to believe the impossible is possible, right? And so, and I think that fiction has always been a great inspirer for us to stretch our boundaries. I mean, the no way we build submarines without Jules Verne. No way, right? No way that we do many of these things without these futurists saying, imagine it could be possible.
Right.
And you probably don't do it the way that they do it, but you get pretty close. And so I think that humans will not particularly want to be faced with brutal, harsh realities. We generally try to find pathways around that, and I'm an optimist, so I think we will. But I do think that the how much we're moving forward in a fantasy way versus how much we're doing it in this way is unusual. And you're seeing this, to your earlier point, is you're now seeing billionaires go into space, and sort of into space. Yeah. Right. But it's a good thing because, you know, I always make an observation. No sci-fi author of the early 20th century or early 21st century ever imagined that humans would go to the moon and then never go back.
Yeah.
That's not like 2001, 2010. It was like, okay, great. 1960s, we get to the moon. By the 1980s, we're here. By the 2000s, not like, hey, in the 60s, we went. And now we really can't even put a person on the moon anymore. Like, no one thought that was the way that this was going to go. And so to some degree, the romance of space travel that has been reignited in the last 3 or 4 years, probably primarily driven by Elon Musk, but a few others, I think is a good thing. Because we went from, we got to do this, we did it, and now we're never doing it again. And that would have been hard to predict, right? And so the thing is, you either do it out of necessity, or you do it out of romance. And it seems right now we're doing it out of romance because we don't yet need to do it, but we better know how to do it if we ever want to.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And, you know, your point about impossible is possible. And when we get that mindset, I mean, that's where fall of the Icarus happened in our mythology. And that's where the aviation industry and any industry that we can think of really started. And this is, like you said, you know, we went to that romantic era because we were in the space race or, you know, superpower race, and then we didn't need to. And now it's being started out by the commercial things. But I want to switch a little bit of gear here. So you talked about, you know, do we have the technology to really explore space? And now I want to pick your brains a little bit more from your healthcare background and digital therapeutics background. Do you see anything happening there right now that would make you feel that we are working on technologies that can expand our powers from being a human to a superhuman that can live in more adverse environments on Earth or otherwise?
I'm not sure if we're going to build any superhumans, but if we could just get humans to be better versions of themselves, we would have done pretty well.
Yes.
So an example, these are some of the things that we have not yet thought about, but I think digital therapeutics could be uniquely powerful at impacting. And actually, my colleague Dave Keen spoke at MIT a couple of years ago, specifically to NASA on this concept of, so one of the things we have not really thought about is the psychological impacts of deep space travel and isolation for extended periods of time to then land on a planet that you cannot like actually walk around outside. So we're talking about specifically deep space travel to Mars. And so one of the things that has not really been thought about is what could be the potential psychosis of those kind of things, and where digital therapeutics could be uniquely powerful at is being able to in lifetime do emotional recognition and providing therapy, feedback, and actions that could help those explorers in that way. And because that's just simply not something that has ever really been thought about, but will have to be thought about, because if you think about that, how would you do that? Well, digital therapeutics is perfectly suited for that, right? It's light, it's flexible, it's non-pharmacological, because we don't really know what the pharmacokinetics of drugs will be in space.
Mm-hmm.
But humans are not robots. Humans are humans, and if they emotionally break down 2/3 of the way to Mars, then we're in real trouble. And so I think that that's an example of how things like digital therapeutics could be remarkably impactful from the mental health standpoint, which will inevitably be a major and misunderstood barrier to entry to doing anything like colonizing the solar system. I mean, just the things around that actually matter a lot. I also think that as we do much better monitoring, and we begin to shift towards precision medicine to super precision medicine, to understand that each individual person is different. And so if you start thinking about people you're putting in space, you're going to really, 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 really want to understand the physiological components of that one person and how you can keep that person in top health. And so whether it be better genomic testing, whether it be better bioinformatics off of the genomics testing, which is some of the stuff that we're working on, whether it be digital medicine that then reacts to that, I think that we will be able to we will be able to help a person or people keep at the very optimal level of their physical and mental states, which will be critical to accomplish any of these kind of things.
Yeah, no, as you were saying this, and as you were addressing both the mental aspect of the travel and the physiological aspect of human bodies and travel, I was just thinking about, when Christopher Columbus left Spain, right, not knowing where he was going and not having digital therapeutics, and, of course, we turned into cannibals, etc. But at least we landed in a friendlier environment where we had a lot of food and a lot of everything. In space, we will not have that, and so certainly we need to be a little bit more prepared as we go. What you talked about is the developments that are happening in the field of medicine that could be potentially applied to space. You also talked about your friend Dave, and he and I are supposed to talk even on this show. But do you see any specific agencies, or do you see any specific efforts, whether in research universities or through your travels anyplace else, where they're actually tackling this topic of space travel and health technology?
So I think we're just now beginning to explore that in a real way, because prior to 2 or 3 years ago, sort of felt like it was the 1980s still. I think one of the biggest shifts is the cost to put a kilo in space.
Yeah.
Right. It's gone from, in fact, we just did a white paper that interestingly enough talked about launches of pharmaceuticals and how it needs to shift. And then what we used as the metaphor, space travel. So it used to cost $56,000 per kilo to put into space. Now it costs around $2,500. Okay, so that's a big shift. Tillman, you are correct to react like that, right? So when cost was no issue, then you can do anything. But it is hard to do anything at scale where you say cost is no issue, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the reason is, and I do think that the both industries are fortunate in that 5 years ago we weren't talking about space travel. We just weren't. Right. And now it is like the theme of the summer.
Yes.
Right.
At least the summer. Yeah.
And now we can say, wow, this is possible. If it only cost me $2,000 to put this, this brick up in space, well, I might be able to do that. Right. And so what's interesting is that let's imagine this happened 10 years ago and there were no digital medicines, there were no digital therapeutics to assist with this. And there was this explosion in space travel, explosion in the idea of deep space flight and the need to physically and mentally put people there. We would still be using very, very traditional ways to prepare those people for things that it will not prepare them for.
Right.
So I actually think that the timing of it, I think the idea that digital therapeutics are actually a few years ahead of what we're going to do with exploration is actually hugely helpful to exploration. Because what you're not trying to do is you're not trying to send bricks of gold to Mars. You're trying to send people to Mars.
Right.
Right. And then you need them to sit there and land there and want to be there and then, be okay coming back or, all those things. And so, how you train a fighter pilot, how you train someone on a nuclear submarine, how you train a traditional astronaut, I surmise, I don't know, I'm not an expert in this, I surmise is going to be different than how you train people that you're hoping to live on Mars for 10 years. And so to me, I actually think for the futurist and space exploration and these new changes, I think healthcare and life science has put itself at the very beating heart, and in many ways is the unknown, or at least unappreciated precursor step for that being able to work. So in other words, it's not just boat technology.
Yeah.
Right. In other words, can the boat cross the ocean? They can, but the people can't. Okay. So have we figured out how to make sure that we could boat cross the ocean and still have people on it?
Right.
And so I think that's the timing is exciting. And I think it's a chance for us in digital medicine, in digital therapeutics, and in life science and healthcare to really lead from the forefront on that, not just for space exploration, which is a big part of what we talked about, but for the future of humanity. I mean, the very, very, very best place for us to find sustainable life is the place we are already on.
Right.
And I think that what we have accomplished in the last 18 months, although the impetus was tragic, is remarkable. And Ruchin, you and I both remember when microRNA felt like flying to Jupiter.
Yes.
Like, what is that? Like, what is this? And what is the application of this? And I guess it's cool, but when would we ever use this? Right.
Within 9 months, we had the vaccine.
Within 9 months, we had the vaccine that is more durable and more remarkable than anything we've ever seen before. And so healthcare and tech, both, but and life science are at the beating heart of saving humanity. And that's what we're doing. Like it's cool in that, and not in the abstract way, not in a 500 years from now, the healthcare innovations of 2020 will save them. It's like, no, like people are alive that wouldn't have been alive. That's how you do that. And so I think it's exciting.
Yeah. So you almost seem to be validating our hypothesis that health technology is really core to what's going to happen next to the human race, whether it's better life on where we are, planet Earth, and or space exploration. Or am I putting words in your mouth?
No, I think it's exactly that. I think we would be remiss to not say we have to do both. And I absolutely think, I don't think it's presumptuous at all to say more than equal to any other sector and more than most, healthcare is what is responsible for putting us in a position to sustainably move into the future. I can't think of another sector that could say it would trump or raise above healthcare.
So what do we do to make sure that we are investing appropriately in healthcare to enable that?
So going back to our very original our original premise is I think, especially all your students, because it's part of it, I think they should be assigned to watch some really cool cartoon shows. So that should be
part of,
exactly. That is the homework. The homework is we'll give you a list of the 10 most exciting cartoons, and then we'll go from there. No, I think that's only a partial joke. I do think saying, have some of these ideas already been explored at remarkable detail that we could learn through? it is inaccurate to say that the only ways that things can be explored is through pie charts and PowerPoints.
Right.
No, humanity finds ways to explore concepts either in written form or, penciled form and sometimes animated form.
Yeah.
That like is a good way to say, oh, wow, we didn't even think about that problem. Yeah, that'd be a big problem. How are we going to feel with this? And so I think that the first thing is say, open up sort of your interest and explore some of these things, because it may challenge you to answer interesting questions. And then the other thing is, I think humanity has done this since its inception, is we invest in response, right? Like yes. Something bad happens and then we're like, wow, we don't want that bad thing to happen anymore, or we want to stop it.
Right.
Why don't we pour bazillions of dollars to try to slow that pace down?
Yeah.
Right. And so part of it is I don't think that investment in life science and healthcare and digital health can stop once the pandemic has moved on. Like it can't just be, oh, we finally realized that healthcare is important to invest in. We spent 2 years investing a ton of money and then we just like went back to normal. I think if we want to be in a position that we're going to have a long-term impact on the future, on humanity, on sustainability, on our relationships, we need to keep investing as we have been doing, because we are already seeing real profound, surprising innovations come out of this. And one of the best examples that I can say is we are doing this class from Zoom.
Yeah.
Okay, so in January of 2020, how many grandparents in the United States knew how to use Zoom? Like 1/10%.
Right.
And right now I'd say that's around 65%.
Yeah.
So from a percentage standpoint, that's, like 500,000%, it's multiple standard deviations increase, but that's going to change things. The idea that like, if I think about it today, I was already in Barcelona, I was in London, then I was in New York. Later tonight, I'll be in Singapore. Today, we're effectively at Seton Hall, but we're just teleporting through that. Like maybe not in 3 dimensions, but at least in a communicating dimension, I'm there.
Yeah.
That's going to create some really thrilling innovation.
Yes.
Really exciting innovation. And none of it would have been possible had we not responded and invested. I mean, I'm thrilled that Zoom's got a bazillion-dollar market cap. They've changed our world.
Yeah.
Right. And Microsoft Teams, what a strange thing, but it is. So all of these things are helping and going faster and faster and faster. And I think the greatest opportunities, profound innovation, is connectivity and investment. And I hope that we continue to lean in this at least for the remainder of this decade, at least for the next 8 years, and say this is healthcare's decade. So if the 2000s belong to sort of energy and defense, and the 2010s belong to consumer tech, and to some degree entertainment, maybe this decade will be healthcare's, and we'll do something profound with that.
Yeah, no, I hope it's just not the decade, but longer term, because like we said, to survive as humans, we need to live as humans.
Well, let's start with a decade. If we tell them we want money for the next 100 years, let's just see if we can get people to commit to a decade of investment, and that'd be a step in the right direction.
Right. Yeah, but what's good is, like you said, we have had those inflection points happen very close together, right? The pandemic and the investment in health tech, and at the same time, in parallel, the inflection point with the space travel. So not many times in the history of planet Earth have those inflection points of that scale have happened at similar points. So I do hope that they continue to intersect more and more, and we go forward.
Well, dare I reference the title of this podcast? One of the reasons for the Industrial Revolution is you needed a series of technologies to happen simultaneously, right? Steel and steam are separate concepts, but they both had to happen at the same time for it to work, right? Yeah. And I think that when we think of these like explosions of technology, you needed you needed, in many ways, very disparate pieces of technology to sort of all come together at the same time. Whether it be movable type printing press coming into being almost the exact same time that metallurgy science was advancing, almost at the exact same time that you were able to build boats that were able to go much further out to sea than ever. All of those come through different origins, but they all happen sort of at the same moment, and then and I feel the same thing is like on the face of it is like, how would space exploration and digital therapeutics and the future of medicine, why are those related? They didn't have to start related to become related and to change the world. So I think we are at this moment that we will look back and say this was a moment that led to a new era, because so many things happened at the same moment, and so hopefully humanity will rise to the occasion.
Absolutely, that's the hope. Tillman, Anthony, any questions do you have?
Yeah, Ed, first and foremost, I just wanted to thank you for making an appearance on the podcast. I thought your insight was great throughout, especially as it relates to, a certain media form that one would not think is necessarily a parallel of the outside world. But with all that being said, I did want to pick your brain a little bit more on digital pharmaceuticals.
Sure.
Digital pharmaceuticals, because that is something that I feel like hasn't been talked about very much in this space. So what might that process look like for an astronaut who's 2/3 of the way to Mars, like you said, and is having psychosis? Could you go into that a little bit and maybe just elaborate?
It's a good question. So you are right. The terms are evolving. I think, in 2021, we're mostly calling them either digital therapeutics or digital medicine, and they'll continue to evolve from a terminology standpoint. But an example is this, right? So there are very well understood cognitive behavioral therapies that can help people cope with moments of stress and moments with crisis, right? The challenge is it may be tough to put a therapist on a spaceship, not the least of which is the therapist might be one of the people having the stress. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you cannot do telehealth in space because you're on 20-hour delay. Okay, so then how could you, in the absence of putting an additional person on, in the boat, how could you find ways to do this? And so examples with things like emotional recognition software, which has become much more advanced over the last couple of years. It's effectively using the geometry of the face, right? And I'm oversimplifying this, but at a high level, corner of eye to corner of lip. Okay, so a frown extends that, a smile tightens that. Imagine that times, thousands of calculations, beginning to get a sense of where someone's mindset would be, potentially even before they do. So an example is a great poker player can read someone's tells. Sometimes the person knows their emotional state and is hiding it, and sometimes the person doesn't even know their emotional state. But a highly sophisticated external observer can, in fact, see that. They can predict what the person may do next, right? Imagine doing that, but doing that in a way that could help the person. Now that's separate from the advantage of what you'd have with wearables. You'd know heartbeat, you'd know blood pressure, you'd know all these things, and being able to say, look, understandably so, you are really missing your family. It's been a while. These triggers are about to happen, as they would with anyone, as they would. And this is not just down to willpower of shove those emotions down and ignore them, right? This is down to, in this moment, can we help coach you through this with effects of the best therapy scaffolded for this exact situation,
right? And
can we deploy that? And I think that's the difference between, you have a library of therapies, which is one thing. You have general therapies with the other. I think that where this is going, especially for situations like this, is it will become so unbelievably sophisticated that knowing for this specific person, when they're going through this specific moment, how can we deploy a behavioral therapy or behavioral intervention, or maybe even in some cases a recommended pharmacological intervention to help that person in that moment. Because it's we all know this, but it is remiss to think that the mind is disconnected from our physical health. We know that we know that and accept that to be true. And so so that's a perfect example of how it could work, and I believe would work, which is, I think, pretty thrilling.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing.
Well, and I just don't. So there's a non-zero chance that when Dave comes and speaks in the podcast, he'll cover that at length. So I don't want to steal his thunder, although I may have all. So act just as surprised and excited when he says the exact same thing.
No worries.
We will. Wonderful. Tillman.
I'll pair it, Anthony. Of course, thank you so much for coming on. I think this was one of our best discussions yet. It was very, very informative, very interesting. One thing I wanted to ask you, because a theme that we touched on tonight, and I do find myself interested in art and media. So we've talked about how life imitates art a little bit, or some of the biggest questions that we have already been answered in a context outside of a traditional classroom setting or boardroom or PowerPoint presentation. So I was wondering if we could pick your brain, and if there's any specific examples, in whether it be an anime or some other art form, that you feel like has answered some really important questions for us.
I mean, I think it's as much about the ones that did a good job of exploring some of the questions, right? Because the answers are going to be challenging, but at least the ones that explored, like, hey, we're going to need to think this through. But I think examples like, one of the most successful is Gundam. And again, like because there are, I love them all. I find them extremely entertaining, but the primary timeline, the Universal Century timeline, is the most hard science. It's the least fantasy, most science. I think that's quite strong. And they're some of those are on Netflix now. I mean, they go all the way back to the 70s. I find some of the ones that were made more recently are a little bit more accessible, just because, like, the animation is better, right? But that's an obvious one. My favorite of all time is Dragon Ball Z, but that is not relevant to this at all. So wildly entertaining. I still believe Goku could take Superman in a fight, but I don't think that I, even in my most creative of conversations, could somehow tie that to this conversation. But it's a good question. I think there are so many. I do think that so this is actually an interesting observation, and then I'll tie it back, is because of what's happened with the pandemic, and because so many of us were trapped in our homes, and so much production in the US got stalled. Disney, Hulu, Netflix have had to source more content from other places.
All over.
And some of this content had already been produced a couple of years ago, but relatively, but it was new to us. And so what's happened is content from all over the world is rushing in for us to be able to see at the click of a button, and that's thrilling and exciting. And so I would say there is a range of these that are coming online. I first got into it with Robotech, which is also called Macross, right? Now that animation is somewhat dated from the 1980s, but it was a hard science one. So I remember as a teenager realizing that a cartoon, that last episode could affect next episode, was crazy. I was like, oh, you mean it's the serialization of a storyline blew my mind away. And then understanding, like, gravitational forces, someone actually talking about that, like, how would these things work? How would they, how would they transform or not transform? And so it's a good question. I knew that question was come. It's like, well, what's your recommended watching list? And I was like, it's almost an overwhelming question. So I will think through it, and after the fact, I will share some of the best. But it's just a new storytelling form that is not new to many people. I mean, there are many fans around the world, but I do think that many of the people making decisions on technology, life science, health, investment, space travel are probably not as up to speed on that storytelling form as they should be, because I think it would inform some of their questions. Maybe not some of their answers, but some of their questions.
Wonderful. Yeah, we can always learn from or we always have. And it's a good recommendation that, we start by watching. And that's a good way to generate the right questions, if not answers right away. So thank you so much. Tillman, Anthony, anything else from your end?
Thank you again, Ed. Like I said, I thought it was really informative and insightful discussion.
Awesome.
And I just have a recommendation, since you said that you like science-oriented storytelling that happens to also be fantastical in nature. Are you familiar with the 3-body problem?
No, do tell.
It's a book series. I don't want to butcher the narrative too much, but it is an Eastern, I believe it's Chinese. It's not Japanese, but it is Chinese. It's an Eastern story, and it's very riveting and very mathematically sound, that happens to tell an amazing story on top of it. So figured you'd be interested.
Awesome.
3-body problem. I love the book. I finished it. I work constructions in the summer, so I have it on audiobook. I finished it in 2 shifts. It was a 30-hour book, and I just listened to it the whole time.
That's amazing. All right. Well, then I've already found it. So now I know something to read. And thank you for that, Tillman. And that's, I think, part of it is that there are some really exciting new conversations, and this is a cool way for us to find things that we haven't yet heard of. I mean, this is a book that got nominated for a Nebula and a Hugo, and I had not heard of it, but now I have. And so, Tillman, thank you for that. And again, sort of to the class and to the listeners and this is kind of the point that I'm leaning into, is the earlier that you expand your horizons and inputs, and the great thing is do it in an entertaining way. Yeah. This is not a grind. These art forms, whether it be books or animes or cartoons or films, are meant to entertain, and yet they can in fact expand the way you think and give different perspectives, understand different cultures, and maybe aspire to build a better future.
Wonderful. Yeah, every art form takes a lot of research and a lot of sweat to create a good story. So there's a lot to learn from there. Thank you so much, Ed, for your time again this afternoon. I know we are almost at the end of the scheduled time, but it's been a pleasure. Hopefully you took something away from this.
Oh, it was wonderful as always.
Yeah, and we love advocates like you who are willing to say, yes, this is the 5th Industrial Revolution and we have to make it work. So wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
And yeah, we will be back in touch soon and talk more.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so
very much.
Wonderful. That was a very interesting discussion with Mr. Ed Cox. And if I were to summarize the key takeaways, one, there is the intersection of space travel and race for space and health technology happening right now. And like in the past, when you have seen those kind of inflection points happen at the same time, something really comes out and really leapfrogs human race to the next level. So we are hopeful. He also did confirm that health technology is really core to where we go next. And so our hypothesis that that's the 5th Industrial Revolution, potentially true. And then lastly, a very, very important lesson that you can always learn from many places, many sources. It doesn't always have to be books or PowerPoints. Watching movies, watching animation, watching entertainment can teach you as effectively as any of the other mediums. So if you have time, look up those new shows that are appearing on Netflix and Hulu and other places. Find time to watch movies. You will not only be entertained, you will learn something new, which is not only romantic, but also scientific. With that, thank you again for watching, and we will be back soon. Thank you.